This is Matt at LSAT Lab. Today's lesson is on flaw questions in the logical reasoning section. Flaw questions sit within the assumption family of logical reasoning, and 57% of all logical reasoning questions are within the assumption family. Flaw questions, 14% of all logical reasoning questions are flaw questions. So it's a very important question type, one that's going to have a big impact on your score, and it's very important that you learn how to master it. It's also one of the harder question types to master. So today's lesson is an introduction into flaw questions. We'll have other lessons about the abstract reasoning errors that are common to the LSAT, but let's just take the generalized approach to flaw questions today. So the way you find a flaw question, the way you recognize that the question that you're working on is a flaw question, is in the language within the question stem. So you're looking for a language that says something like, there's a flaw in the reasoning and you're trying to describe it. Or, which one of the following describes the questionable technique used in the argument above? Or, try this one. Is this a flaw question? Well, notice the language. The reasoning is fallacious, right? That sounds very much like it's got a flaw in it. So it's a flaw question. What about this one? Well, language here, takes for granted, is a little different. So taking something for granted is like assuming something to be true. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're being asked to describe the error of reasoning. It means that you're being asked to find the gap in the reasoning. This is a necessary assumption question. Try this one. What's the key language? Well, it's telling you that the argument is vulnerable to criticism. Right? And you're being asked to figure out, describe what it is that it's vulnerable to. So this is definitely a flaw question. Try this one. Well, here, the key language, they're asking for the flawed reasoning that is most similar to the flawed reasoning in which one of the following. Right? So in this case, there is a flaw in the reasoning, but you're not trying to describe it. You're trying to duplicate it. This is a parallel flaw question. Try this one. So here, they're saying that the argument is vulnerable to criticism, and that criticism is going to suggest that it's a flaw question. Good. So the process that you're going to take when you're working on a flaw question is the same that you take whenever you're working on any question type within the assumption family, which is first you need to find the conclusion of the argument, then find the evidence that is being used to support that conclusion. Then you want to evaluate the reasoning, meaning you need to figure out whether you need to judge the argument. Figure out whether it's good or bad and why. And the key here is that every question within the assumption family is flawed. Right? So when you go to evaluate it, the answer should be it's bad and here's why. The hard part is the why part, right? And that's where the reasoning structures start to come into play, and you start looking for conditional logic or causation or comparison in order to be able to figure out what the gap in the reasoning is. Then once you have an understanding of what's wrong with the argument, you want to anticipate what an answer might sound like based off of what you're being asked to accomplish. So in this case, you're going to be asked to accomplish something like describing in an abstract way what the error of reasoning was that occurred. You're going to try to describe that error of reasoning, and then you go look at the answer choices looking for what you came up with. 71% of all flaw questions contain some kind of comparative reasoning structure. So comparison is a major reasoning structure within flaw questions. Here's an example question. Go ahead and give this one a try. Hit pause, try this question on your own, see if you can find an answer that you like, and when you're ready to discuss, go ahead and hit play and we'll come back and discuss it together. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. First, we need to find the conclusion. And in this case, the last sentence that says, this finding clearly demonstrates that, in general, people are more willing when they are younger than when they are older to reveal personal financial information to strangers over the telephone. That represents the conclusion of the argument. So what's the evidence? Well, it says that those conducting the survey observed that the older the person being queried, the more likely it was that he or she would refuse to answer any of the questions. Okay, so we have this survey, and we know that the older the person being queried, the more likely it was that he or she would refuse to answer any of the questions. Does that necessarily mean that in general people are more willing when they are younger than when they are older to reveal personal financial information to strangers over the telephone? Well, some of you might be thinking, well, yeah, but this is just a survey. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's representative of the real world. But remember that first sentence says that as part of a survey, approximately 10,000 randomly selected individuals were telephoned and asked a number of questions about their income and savings. So these are randomly selected individuals, and there are approximately 10,000 of them. There's no basis for believing that the survey is somehow skewed, not based off of the information that's presented in the information, right? So we want to be thinking about, okay, why doesn't that conclusion follow from the evidence, given how similar those two claims are? Well, if we think about it, they're suggesting that the younger you are, the more likely you are to answer the questions. The older you are, the less likely you are to answer those questions, right? Inside of this survey, right? But if you look at the conclusion a little bit more carefully, there's something strange happening here. They're suggesting that people are more willing when they are younger than when they are older. That conclusion is a relative comparison between the same individual. The way comparisons typically work on the LSAT, it usually takes one of two forms. Either you're going to compare two different things at a point in time, which is very much like the premise. They're comparing younger people's responses with older people's responses. But another way comparisons typically work is that they compare something over two different periods of time. So maybe it's the population of city X today versus the population of city X 10 years ago. In the latter case, so when you're comparing one thing over two different time periods, that's a very different thing when you're comparing two different things at a point in time. The premise is comparing two different things at a point in time, while the conclusion is comparing one person when they are younger versus when they are older. Right? So this comparison is a little bit different the way it's presented in the conclusion than the way it is presented in the evidence. And what we're looking for is something along the lines that, hey, the conclusion is about one individual at two different points in time, while the evidence is more about two different people at a point in time. And maybe we can find an answer choice that resonates with that idea. So when we look at the answer choices, answer choice A says that it offers no evidence that the individuals queried would have reported differently had they been asked the same questions in years prior to the survey. So, it's hard to say exactly what that means or how that relates, but it does seem like it's talking about one individual at two different points in time. That would be an answer choice that I would hold on to and just keep and see if anything else shows up that's better. Answer choice B says, fails to specify the exact number of people who were telephoned as part of the survey. Well, it's true. It does fail to specify the exact number of people who were telephoned. But is that a problem? I mean, they did have approximately 10,000 people in this study or in this survey. Do they need to name exactly how many people were actually telephoned? Right? Answer choice B is describing something accurately that happened within the argument, but it's not a flaw. Right? They didn't need to specify the exact number of people, especially when you're dealing with numbers as large as 10,000 randomly selected individuals. So one common trap answer choice on flaw questions is an answer choice that correctly describes something that's happening within the argument, but that isn't a flaw. And what makes it tempting is that it's accurately describing something that happened. Answer choice C says, it assumes without warrant that age is the main determinant of personal income and savings levels. Well, this isn't really about your personal savings and income levels, but more about your willingness to share that information with others. So what's the cause of their personal income and savings isn't really relevant to this argument here. This is actually out of scope. Answer choice D says that assumes from the outset what it purports to establish on the basis of a body of statistical evidence. At the very beginning, you get a very good sense of what this flaw is describing. It assumes at the outset what it purports to establish. This is describing an error of reasoning called circular reasoning. It's a flaw where you assume what you seek to establish. It's what happens when a conclusion merely restates a premise in the argument. So that's a flaw. It's just not a flaw that's happening in this argument. So it's the wrong flaw. And this is another very common, tempting, wrong answer on flaw questions. An answer choice that correctly describes a flaw, but not one that's happening within the argument. Answer choice E says, provides no reason to believe that what is true of a given age group in general is also true of all individuals within that age group. So this again is describing an error of reasoning that's very common on the LSAT. It's about parts to whole. What's true of the individual member of a group isn't necessarily true of the group itself. What's true of the group itself isn't necessarily true of any individual member of the group. But parts to whole isn't what's going on here. Right? This is simply describing the wrong flaw. So we can eliminate answer choice E, and that brings us back to A. It offers no evidence that the individuals queried would have responded differently had they asked the same questions in years prior to the survey, meaning there's no way based off of the evidence to know that the people would have responded differently previously. So we can't compare an individual to themselves in a previous time period, which is what the conclusion is trying to do, when all we have is information about different individuals at a given point in time. So answer choice A is correct. If you picked that, great. Congratulations. So the next reasoning structure I want to look at is causation. Causation also plays an important role on flaw questions. About 28% of flaw questions involve a causal reasoning structure. So let's see how it plays out. Here is an example question. Go ahead and try this question on your own. Pause the recording, and when you're ready to discuss it together, hit play again. Great. Welcome back. So first things first, we find the conclusion. And in this case, the conclusion is the last sentence. Thus, the weather must have played an important role in bringing about the crisis. Okay, so what's the evidence for that? Well, it tells us that insufficient rain can cause crops to falter and agricultural prices to rise. And records indicate that during a certain nation's crisis, faltering crops and rising agricultural prices prompted the government to take over food distribution in an effort to prevent starvation. Well, it kind of feels like they're moving in the direction of correlation versus causation, but they didn't actually correlate the two events in the evidence. So in the conclusion, they're talking about weather being the cause of the crisis, right? The food distribution crisis, right? But in the evidence, we have records indicating that during a certain nation's recent crisis, that they had these faltering crops and rising agricultural prices, but it doesn't actually say anything about the weather in there. If we look at the first sentence, however, it does say insufficient rain, so that's weather, can cause crops to falter and agriculture prices to rise. So at least in the first sentence, we get both of the factors, both the weather and the crisis. And in the conclusion, we get the weather and the crisis, right? But we don't actually have a correlation between the two events, then going on to conclude a causal relationship between the two events. Instead, what we have is a degree issue. Notice that in the conclusion, there's the word must. But in the evidence, we have the word can, right? So just because insufficient rain can cause crops to falter and agriculture prices to rise, that doesn't necessarily mean that the weather must have played an important role in bringing about the crisis. So in this case, if we're going to anticipate what an answer might sound like, we're looking for something about how the degree of the conclusion is much stronger than the degree in the evidence, right? The argument treats something that is possible as though it were inevitable. So let's look at the answer choices. Answer choice A says that it concludes merely from the fact that the period of insufficient rain occurred before the nation's crisis, that insufficient rain caused the nation's... Well, the problem with answer choice A is that they didn't actually establish the correlation that answer choice A is suggesting occurred, right? They never actually said that the insufficient rain occurred before the nation's crisis. So this one's simply unsupported, right? That didn't happen within the argument. Answer choice B says that it fails to take into account the possibility that the scarcity was not severe enough to justify the government's taking over food distribution. Well, whether or not the government was justified in doing so or not justified in doing so isn't really relevant to the argument's conclusion. So this is simply out of scope. Answer choice C says it uses the term crisis equivocally in the reasoning, referring to both a political crisis and an economic crisis. So this is describing a flaw that is going to show up, at least within the answer choices, quite regularly. Equivocation, or using equivocal language, is simply what happens when an argument uses a key term with two different meanings over the course of the argument. But in this case, crisis isn't really used over the course of the argument with two different meanings, right? This is simply another one of those answer choices that's describing a flaw, but not one that happened within the argument. So we can label this one as being the wrong flaw. Answer choice D says, infers merely from the fact that one event could have caused a second event, that the first event in fact caused this. This sounds exactly like what we're looking for. It's moving from could to did. So let's hold on to answer choice D. Answer choice E says, it takes for granted that any condition that is necessary for an increase in agriculture prices is also sufficient for such an increase. Again, this is also talking about a common flaw on the LSAT. In fact, the flaw that's being described in answer choice E is probably the most common flaw that occurs on the LSAT, either with the language of the actual question or how students interpret the information. Right? So what E is describing is a reversed logic, where they're suggesting that there's a if-then relationship that's occurring somewhere in the argument, and that if-then relationship is reversed somehow between the evidence and the conclusion. But in this case, there isn't an if-then relationship. This is not about conditional logic. This is about causation. So answer choice E is describing the wrong flaw again, which allows us to choose D as the correct answer. So let's take a look one more time at another reasoning structure. This one's conditional logic. This one's not as common as the other two. It's still 23% of flaw questions involve conditional reasoning, though. So it's an important reasoning structure. And let's take a look at a real example. Go ahead and pause the recording. Try this on your own. When you think you've got an answer, hit play, and we'll discuss it together. Great. Welcome back. So first things first, we find the conclusion. And in this case, the conclusion is the first sentence of the argument. In order to succeed in today's society, one must have a college degree. Okay. Why do they say that? Well, they tell us that, actually, if we look at that next sentence, skeptics have objected that there are many people who never completed any education beyond high school, but who are nevertheless quite successful. This sounds like a counterexample to the original claim. This point isn't moving in support of the conclusion. It's actually moving against the conclusion. We call this an opposing point. It's not actually part of the argument. So then we look at the next sentence. This success is only apparent, however. So that you can see with that word, however, a pivot back to the author's position. And then the word because is telling us the evidence. So actually, it's giving us a little bit more than that. This says this success is only apparent because what comes after the word because is a premise, and what comes before that because becomes a conclusion. And since we already know that the first sentence of the argument is the main conclusion, this success is only apparent becomes an intermediate conclusion. And then the last part of that last sentence becomes the premise. Okay, so, what are we doing here? Well, we see that in the conclusion of the argument, it says, in order to succeed in today's society, one must have a college degree. And the word must is telling us that there's an if-then relationship. Right? In order to succeed in today's society, one must have a college degree. So if you don't have a college degree, then you're not going to succeed. And they tell us in the evidence that in order to succeed, you have to have a college degree. So, these two ideas seem very similar. In fact, if you take the contrapositive of the conclusion, you'll recognize that it's simply saying the exact same thing as a premise. We saw a description of this flaw earlier in a previous question, where the conclusion merely restates a premise. We can describe this flaw as a circular reasoning. And so we're looking for the argument is circular, or the conclusion merely restates a premise. But essentially, we're looking for something that says that the conclusion is merely restating one of the premises that was used in support of it. And the reason why this is flawed is when you're judging an argument, you always assume the evidence is true. The only thing you question is whether the conclusion follows from that evidence. But if the conclusion is something that you already assumed to be true, then you haven't really proven anything. Right? So let's look at the answer choices. Answer choice A says that it assumes what it sets out to conclude. That sounds pretty good. Let's hold on to answer choice A. Answer choice B says it mistakes a correlation for a cause. This is another common flaw, mistaking correlation for causation. But it's just not the flaw that's happening within this argument. So it's the wrong flaw. Answer choice C says that it draws a highly general conclusion from evidence about individual cases. Again, this is a flaw on the LSAT. You're not allowed to generalize from a few example cases. This is very much like stereotyping. But just because it's true of some individuals doesn't necessarily mean it's true of all individuals. Generalizations are generally not valid on the LSAT. So this is describing a flaw, but not one in the argument. This is wrong flaw. Also, there's a contradiction involved here, right? It draws a highly general conclusion from individual cases, right? But there is no individual cases here. These are all generalized claims. So whether we wanted to describe answer choice C as contradicting the argument because it's describing something that's different than what happened, or whether we want to describe it as the wrong flaw, we could do it either way. If we look at answer choice D, it fails to consider the status of alleged counterexamples. Well, that's actually not true. Skeptics have objected that there are many people, blah, blah, blah. So they did consider those counterexamples. So answer choice D, again, contradicts what happened in the argument. Answer choice E says it bases its conclusion on irrelevant evidence. Is that evidence irrelevant? Well, it's relevant. It's the same thing. So, we could describe this as contradiction. We could describe this as the wrong flaw. I mean, it would be a flaw to base a conclusion on irrelevant evidence, but it's also something that didn't happen in this argument. So either way. All right. So now that we can pick A, let's step back a little bit and think about the kinds of wrong answers that we were seeing. Okay. When we look at flaw questions, generally speaking, 29% of the wrong answers can be described as being out of scope. 23% of the wrong answers can be described as describing the wrong flaw. 14% of wrong answers can be described as contradicting the information in the argument. 5% can be described as simply not a flaw. It's not what they're describing happened, but it's not a flaw. 3% are simply irrelevant comparisons. 2% are strengthening the argument instead of weakening it. 14% are presenting the information in stronger ways than what actually happened within the argument, and 9% are presenting what happened in a weaker way than what actually happened within the argument. So these are the trap answers that you really want to be on the lookout for, and it's a good idea that when you're working through flaw questions and all questions within the logical reasoning section, that you work hard to try to characterize the wrong answers with a generic label so that you can apply it to the next question that you get to. And this will help you when you're working on a question on test day. Try to figure out when you're torn between two that you're just going to start to think about, like, here are the common things that go wrong within the answer choices. Do I see any of them happening within this particular set of answer choices? So in summary, you spot a flaw question by the language within the question stem, and you're looking for a flaw in the reasoning, or vulnerable to criticism, or there's a questionable technique or fallacious reasoning. When you see language like that, you're on a flaw question. The reasoning structures you want to be on the lookout for. 71% of all flaw questions involve a comparison of some sort. 28% involve causal reasoning structures. And 23% involve conditional logic. So obviously there's an overlapping sets here. Some arguments have more than one reasoning structure, but you can see that comparison is the major player when you're working on flaw questions. The trap answers you want to be paying attention to: out of scope, wrong flaw, an answer choice that's simply too strong, or an answer choice that contradicts the argument, an answer choice that is simply too weak, or an answer choice that's describing something that happened, but that actually isn't a flaw. So that's it for flaw questions. I invite you to watch these other videos about the logical reasoning section, and we'll see you next time.